So it's always a pleasure to be here. Let me tell you one thing that spurred me, something similar to what happened to Richard Rodriguez, happened to me when I was at our nation's museum, the Smithsonian. I was working back there as a law student when I was at UCLA Law School back in 1970. I was sent back to work in the Justice Department. So at that time, it was the 25th anniversary of the ending of World War II, 1945, 1970. So I see in the paper that the Smithsonian is going to have an exhibit on World War II, commemorating the 25th anniversary of the end of World War II. My dad, two of my uncles on my dad's side, 23 of his cousins all served in World War II. On my mom's side, her brother, and she had a couple of other cousins that served in World War II. I didn't know my wife at that time because we didn't get married until a couple of years later. She had a bunch of family also in World War II. In either case, I go over there to see the exhibit, and I see a beautiful, the hall was filled with blow-ups of Stalin and Churchill and Roosevelt meeting at Yalta, and our troops storming the beaches at Normandy, our troops hitting Okinawa, and I look, hey, that's where my dad was at. My dad hit the beaches in Okinawa, April 1, 1945. And I see all these great visions of World War II, and then I see some beautiful portraits of African Americans serving in the segregated units in World War II. And they juxtapose those with the pictures of segregated home people. African Americans in segregated schools, segregated housing back at home. And so it's a very powerful image. You see these African Americans at home on the home front, and then you see them as patriots, putting their lives on the line and serving our country in battle. Wow, powerful images. And then they had another beautiful exhibit on Japanese Americans, very similar. They had the Japanese American families behind barbed wires in the concentration camps that we set up for them here stateside. And then they had the 442nd out there, the most decorated regiment in World War II, fighting in Italy and in Germany. Very, very proud units fighting there. And you see those articles, and you see their blow-ups and their pictures of it. Then you see, man, African Americans, Japanese Americans, they're patriots. They're not enemies of the state. And I'm looking for Latinos. And what do I see?
One.
No. Articles from the Los Angeles Times about Mexican Americans fighting our troops in East LA. If you recall, there was something called the Zoot Suit riots.
Yeah.
And what it was, there were a few Navy guys that went into East LA, going to the bars, and they got into a fight with a couple of guys.
Leave it to the Navy.
I don't know what it was over, if it was over a girl, if it, you know, but it was just a fight of a few guys. Fist fight. Well, the next night, what the Navy guys did, they brought busloads of Navy personnel into East LA. Well, East LA wasn't a port. Long Beach was where the Navy guys were, but they came into East LA. They brought in busloads of guys, and those guys started looking for anybody in zoot suits. So they were getting Filipinos who were dressed in zoot suits, Mexican Americans who were dressed in zoot suits, African Americans who were dressed in zoot suits, and they started stripping them of their zoot suits just because they were dressed in zoot suits. If you look at the actual events, you'll see that's what happened. But the newspapers played it up that Mexican Americans were fighting against naval personnel, and that's what the headlines read. So we were posed, and that went on for a couple of nights until the Navy put a stop to it. They said, hey, we're not sending any more buses out there. We're stopping that. And it stopped it. Well, it was just, like I said, a few guys that started it initially, fist fight. It wasn't anything they were going out looking for Navy personnel to fight, but the newspapers made it look like it was Mexican Americans, enemies, fighting against our troops. And yet we know that East LA was cleaned up of any Latinos who were 18 and over. You had hundreds of them going into World War II, getting drafted and volunteering, and in all forms of the service. So when I saw that, it angered me. I said, wait a minute, I don't see any positive images of Latinos, let alone no images. All I see is negative images. It really angered me because I knew our heritage. People on the East Coast maybe didn't. Maybe African Americans didn't. Maybe Jewish Americans on the East Coast didn't know that. But certainly we knew that here on the West Coast. But so that was the beginning of, that's what kind of set that little thing that eventually exploded, set off that in me to start documenting. So about 18 years ago, my wife and I started setting up a program at Santa Ana College, and then we went to Cal State Fullerton to document the service of our Latino veterans in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and we wrote books. We interviewed and profiled over 2,000 Latino veterans, even from World War I. Most of those guys, all of those men were dead from World War I, but we knew their families. Like my grandfather registered for World War I, but he didn't get taken over. My wife's grandfather also registered for World War I. He didn't get taken over, but we knew people that had family that went into World War I. So we've documented their service. All of that now is put on a website that is maintained by the Orange County Department of Education. You Google American Patriots of Latino Heritage, and it'll get you to that website. And what we want to do is continue to get more profiles to add to that website. Dr. Al Mijares, the superintendent of schools for the Orange County Department of Education, and I have collaborated to work out to get this website set up. And so all of the information, profiles on all of our Latino veterans can be put onto that website, American Patriots of Latino Heritage. And the reason we started with the word American, because if you put Mexican, they put us into a category. Anybody that goes in Google and searching puts us into a box of immigration, illegals. American, and that puts us into a different category. So I put American Patriots of Latino Heritage. I know it's a long title, but anyway, I just wanted to share with you that that's what we've done, and that's what I'm doing now, continuing to supplement that website, American Patriots of Latino Heritage, with information, with documentation, photographs, and even personal interviews. I've interviewed Tony, interviewed Mr. Garcia, our World War II veterans, and now I'm taking that time off to go do that. You know, I'm a full-time judge. I don't have time to, I'm not a full-time historian. I do that on the side to document, interview our veterans. That's what I'm trying to do on my time. But short of that, getting photographs and other information into that website. Okay. So
Judge, can you tell us too a little bit about the Mendez versus Westminster education? Because I know you've been involved with that too.
I've spoken on that case in Washington, D.C., in Sacramento. Last year they asked me to speak on it at the University of Kansas City School of Law because they had a 50th commemoration of Brown versus Board of Education. Brown versus Board of Education, as you all know, was the case that busted up segregated schools across the nation in 1954. And so last year was 2014, it was the 60th anniversary. I've done the 50th anniversary back in Washington, D.C. There was a case that came out of Orange County that was filed in the Los Angeles Federal Court called Gonzalo Mendez, Lorenzo Ramirez. There was several other families that fought the segregated schools in their districts, Garden Grove, Westminster, Santana, Orange, and Modena. Those are the school districts that these families represented, and they filed a class action lawsuit against those school districts because those school districts maintained segregated schools for Latino children. In my hometown in Placencia, they also had segregated schools, but my dad and his cousins and his uncle, his brothers were all in World War II. At the time the lawsuit was filed, on February 27, 1945, and my dad was on his way to Okinawa with his brother also, who fought in the 96th. division over in Okinawa. Anyway, that case, the federal court judge found that it was unconstitutional to segregate Mexican-American children into separate schools because they were not equal. There's no way you could have separate but equal schools. That's what he held. Even if you have the same books, same size classroom, same chairs and tables, curriculum, everything the same, you can't have equal schools when they're segregated. Just like segregating, for whatever reason, kids who are under 5 foot against kids who are over 5 foot doesn't make any sense. But in either case, the court, in that case, by the time it went to the appellate court, 1947, held that it was unconstitutional to segregate children because of their race or their background. That was 7 years before Brown versus Board of Education. So I've studied that case, the Mendez case, and I talk about all the people that were involved in it, not just the litigants, not just the families, or Ramirez family, Mendez family, and all those, but the attorneys. We had Japanese-American attorneys that helped out, African-American attorneys that helped out. We had Mexican-American groups that helped out. We even had a Swedish immigrant that helped out by the name of Earl Warren. His parents had come over from Sweden, kind of like Nordstrom and Segerstrom. But in either case, I talk about all these people of goodwill that helped on the Mendez case. And I have a PowerPoint presentation, and I've presented it at different locations regarding that case. Like I said, I've presented it across the United States. It's a fascinating case, and I should write a book on it because of that. But there have been a couple of books that have come out since, but it's still a relatively unknown case. When I went through law school, I never heard about it because they didn't teach it. Now they're starting to teach it.
But the arguments, weren't they the ones that were, when they won in 1947 in California, weren't they the same ones that were used to get rid of segregation in 1954?
Exactly. It was the genesis of Brown versus Board of Education. In fact, the two architects of the Brown case, Thurgood Marshall and Robert Carter, who were with the NAACP, that fought the Brown case in front of the United States Supreme Court, argued in the appellate court case here, in the Mendez case, on behalf of the families, because they saw what happened at the trial court, and they said, wait a minute, they weren't involved in the trial court stage, but when it went up to the appellate court, they heard about it, and they got involved in the appellate court aspect of it to use the same argument that was used in the trial courts. They used that same argument in the Supreme Court case of Brown versus Board of Education. So very seminal. And then there's another case here out of Orange County, the Bernal case. That's another key case, and that came out in 1943. Mr. Bernal bought a house in Fullerton, and when he bought the house, the families all around there said, wait a minute, all this development is only for white people. You can't live here because it says in our deed, it's racial restrictive covenant. Only white people can live in this neighborhood. So no Latinos could live there, no Chinese, no African Americans, Indians, Hindus. And so he said, well, I bought the land, I'm not going to move. So his neighbors sued him to kick him out. And in other areas, they did enforce that racial restrictive covenant. There was a lady by the name of Haiti McDaniel. Did you ever see Gone with the Wind? She was the African-American lady that was the maid, the big heavyset maid, and she got an Academy Award. She tried to buy a house out in the West Adams district. At that time, it was all white. She had the money. They wouldn't sell to her because she was African-American. Anyway, one of the attorneys in that case helped file the lawsuit, helped defend Mr. Bernal in this case. When he was sued, he needed an attorney. He had to go to LA. He got a Jewish American attorney and an African American attorney to help him out. They came over, they helped him out, and they helped convince the judge here, a local Superior Court judge like myself, that it was unconstitutional to enforce a racial restrictive covenant. That was 4 years before Shelley versus Kramer, the national case, went up to the United States Supreme Court, primarily financed by Jewish Americans who were also held out of buying homes in certain areas. That's why when Jews came to LA, they had to be in East LA, they had to settle along Brooklyn Avenue, which is now Cesar Chavez. Cantor's used to be there before it went out onto Fairfax Avenue, out on the west side. Jews couldn't buy out around UCLA. They couldn't buy out on the west side. Racial restrictive covenants. So we had a case here in 1943, 4 years before the national case of Shelley versus Kramer in 1947. So that held nationally in 1947. Nationally it was found, the United States Supreme Court found racially restrictive covenants are unlawful. But up to 1947 it was lawful to do that, to keep people from buying in certain areas, whether they could afford it or not. Anyway, so there's a lot of history here in Orange County. That's what I'm doing now. I'm unearthing those kinds of gems and talking to people about it and sharing with them the courage of Latinos and the help that they got from Jewish American attorneys, Japanese American attorneys, African American attorneys, people of goodwill that helped them to get dignity restored to them.
You know, thank you, Judge. You know, well, lastly, you know why I say it was a treat to have Judge Aguirre here. So thank you for that.
Governor Warren became the United States Supreme Court Justice, and so he had all that background from California, from this Hispanic people. So when Brown versus the Board of Education, he already had all that background to really go with integration.
He also authored the other case of Hernandez versus Texas, and that was a famous case out of Texas where a fellow by the name of Hernandez was in a bar and he got into a fight with a white guy, and the white guy ended up dead after the fight. Now Mr. Hernandez said, hey, the guy came at me with a beer bottle and that's why I stabbed him with my knife. So it was in self-defense. Well, Mr. Hernandez was tried before a jury of his peers, all white people in Texas, in that county. And his attorneys, very smart attorneys, Gus Garcia was one of the brightest attorneys ever. He was the attorney for, later on, for Governor Connolly. And you all remember who Governor Connolly was. He was the one that was riding in the car with Kennedy when Kennedy was shot in 1963. Anyway, and Gus Garcia graduated first out of the University of Texas, I think like in 1938. Anyway, so he takes the case up to the Supreme Court arguing that Mr. Hernandez was not tried by a jury of his peers. He was denied the constitutional right to have a jury of his peers because he was able to show that what they would do in Texas was keep Mexican Americans off juries. Poll taxes, written tests that were skewed, all kinds of, you see the movie Selma and you'll see what they used to do. And anyway, they kept Mexican Americans off juries. No Mexican Americans ever served on a jury. Yet we know Mexican Americans lived in Texas. I always tell people who built the Alamo, right? So
remember the Alamo.
So what happened was, it was Warren that wrote the decision and got his other justices to agree that this man was denied the right to a fair trial, and on a 7-zip decision. As you all know, Mr. Warren, as I told you, his parents were immigrants, came out here kind of like the Seegerstroms. Seegerstroms were not wealthy. His dad came out without a penny in his pocket and just started, saving up, and they bought 1 acre, and then they bought 10 acres, and they bought 20, and then before you knew it, they bought 2,000. But they were very, very thrifty Swedish farmers. In either case, Warren's parents came from Sweden. He was born in LA in 1898. His dad worked on the railroad tracks up in the San Fernando Valley, in the San Fernando Valley initially, and then up in the San Joaquin Valley. Well, who do you think he worked with on the railroad tracks?
Mexican people.
There you go. Well, maybe some Chinese, but they were Mexicans. They were Mexicans. They were right, because my grandfather.
Chinese Mexicans.
My grandfather worked at Renganche on the railroads, and I'm sure some of you have heard that, or had family that did that too. So Warren grew up with Mexican Americans, and you know who his best bunk buddy was? He trained in World War I. He trained with the famous actor Leo Carrillo. They trained together to go to World War I. Were just about ready to go. They were already on the docks to go when 11/11, 1918, they declared an armistice in Europe. But it was Leo Carrillo, with his contacts in the Hollywood industry, that helped Warren's campaigns, Warren ran for governor 3 times, 42, 46, and 40, and 50, and was elected on a bipartisan ticket each time. And he knew that one of his key supporters was a Mexican-American guy by the name of Leo Carrillo. He'd come down to Leo Carrillo's ranches in Santa Barbara and in Vista, and he'd come and hobnob at the Hollywood events that Leo Carrillo would set up. Anyway, I gotta shut up so you guys.
Do you know anything about
I could be here all day.
Anything you can tell us from the Felix Longoria in Texas, when the American Uniform got started?
Sure. Felix Longoria was born in Three Rivers, Texas, about 1920. He was killed over in the Philippines, and in 1947, as you all know, you could have the remains of your loved ones brought back. They were buried in our cemeteries. All those men who were killed in action were buried in our cemeteries overseas. We have cemeteries in the Philippines, we have them in Europe, we have them all over. But if you wanted to, you could leave them there, or you could have their remains brought back. So in 1947, the family of Felix Longoria asked the government, would you please have his remains brought back to Three Rivers, Texas, so that we can bury him with our families here in Three Rivers, Texas. So they said, sure, we're doing that for everybody else. So they brought his remains back in a casket, and when the family went to the local mortuary to have his remains, interred in the cemetery, that local mortuary that owned the cemetery refused to do that. They said, no Mexicans are buried in our cemetery. So Mr. Longoria's family didn't know what to do, so they contacted Dr. Garcia, the founder of the GI Forum. Dr. Garcia, it's funny about Dr. Garcia, he was from a family of 12 migrant farm workers, but he was a smart kid, and so was his whole family. I think there were 3 doctors out of his family, and 4 nurses, and a couple of attorneys, and so they were just a bright group. He went to St. Mary's, a Catholic school there in Texas, got his medical degree. When the war came along, 1942, 43, he volunteered. He goes up to the to the board there, and they say, when he goes in for induction, he says, I'm a medical doctor, and so obviously they should have made him an officer and put him as an officer in the medical corps, right? They said, he even had his medical degree with him, but because he was Mexican, they said, all right, private, you got to go through boot camp and the whole bit. So they didn't have him go through the officers' candidate school. He went through boot camp. He went through just like anybody else who only maybe went to the 6th grade, and he goes through. When he gets overseas, when he gets to Europe, it's not until then that he's over there on the front, and they're telling him, well, you know about medicine? Yeah, I'm a medical doctor. What the hell? How come you didn't get, It's not until then that they put him into being a medical doctor, and of course he's with Patton, and he serves out his time with Patton in the 3rd Army all the way to the Rhine. And he comes back to Texas, and in the movie Giant, the lady that wrote that book, Giant, Margaret Morrow, or whatever her name is, she based the character of the Mexican doctor whose daughter marries the son of Elizabeth Taylor and Rock Hudson, Jody. That kid that marries the girl, that girl's dad is Dr. Garcia. So she used Dr. Garcia as her character for that Mexican doctor in that movie. I think Maurice Jara came out as the doctor in Giant, yeah. Anyway, Dr. Garcia, the family of Longoria, calls him and he says, well, shoot, you know what? I know a guy by the name of Lyndon Baines Johnson, who's our congressman, and maybe he can help us out. Lyndon Baines Johnson was a poor cracker. He went through college, and where did he go to teach? He went to teach along the Texas border, teaching primarily Latino kids. His first teaching assignment was along the Texas border, teaching Mexican kids, I think in Brownsville or someplace. Pura raza. And so he already understood Latino kids, he already understood Latinos, and so he became a congressman, pretty wheeler and dealer, smart guy. He tries to convince the Three Rivers people to allow Longoria to be buried there. They won't budge. He says, you know what, the hell. We've got Arlington Cemetery back in Washington, D.C. Why don't we have him buried there with full military honors? And so that's what they did. So they had him buried there with full military honors. But you know what? How sad it is. I've been to Arlington 3 times, and never once did any of those Negro tour guides tell us that he's buried there. They'll tell me about the other guys. They'll tell me about a Negro admiral. They'll tell me about somebody else who was from World War I, and somebody else that did this, and somebody else that did that, but they won't tell me about where Felix Longoria is buried. I'm sure I can find out. I'm sure the record is there. But maybe it's not too accurate because they had some problems with Arlington a few years ago. But in either case, he's buried there. So full military honors. We need to make sure that we get that clearly put on the tour, that maybe we get a monument in his honor so that the story can be told. I go back to Washington, D.C., and to Japanese Americans, very smart. What they did, they got a park that they got the government to buy the land. It's close to the train station, between the train station and Library of Congress. So it's on a very good path. A couple of major hotels nearby. They built out the park where it honors all of the 442nd and the 101st guys. It has all their names engraved there. It has all the names of the places that the Japanese Americans were interned, at Poston, Manzanar, Arkansas, all those different places. Tells the story. You go there and the story is there, and it's engraved in the granite. Beautiful park. We taxpayers pay for the maintenance of that. But it's now a national park. Pretty smart. They paid for the development of it, to build it, but we maintain it in perpetuity for the Japanese American Association. But in either case, we should do something for Felix Longoria to showcase what he did, and what happened back in 1947. Anyway.
Judge, again, thank you. In all, because they got you pissed off in the beginning. An emotion like that put to very good use. You know, I've been able to attend a lot of the events that you've done at Castlefold. Many of us have been there. We got the books, Latino Advocates for Education, right? That created those 3 books. And again, thank you, Judge Aguirre. It's really an honor. And also that in case some people need to leave, or yourself, Judge, Judge Aguirre is here to do the induction of our board and officers. So Judge, lead us, and I would hate to see when somebody pisses you on the bench and they do something unconstitutional.
I tell people when they come before me on criminal cases, be sure to bring their own toothbrush, right? Just be prepared. Okay. All right. Well, the members of the board of directors, please come up. Francisco Barragan.